going to tackle a bit of a sensitive subject this morning. Is that all right? A quote. They were like savages, like some horror out of the night. And I can't forget their faces, twisted with hate. It was like looking at white-faced demons. Hate did that to them. This is a quote by a man, John Perkins, who on the 7th of February 1970 was with a group of students, African American, and a bunch of white policemen came in and rounded up the students and put them into prison unjustly and took John Perkins as the leader of that group. And as they got to the police station, 5 deputy sheriffs and between 7 and 12 highway patrolmen came out and would beat him and beat him and beat him. And as they beat him and as he started to bleed, they would make him clean up his blood. And then he started to lose consciousness. And then they would wake him up and they would make him clean his own blood as they continued to beat him. And they beat him to within an inch of his life. And he was left for dead. And some kind people found him in the police station parking lot and took him off to hospital. And in the days that followed, as he started to recover, there was a white man in the 1970s, we've got to remember the context, that would come. A white man that symbolized the very system that had put him into that comatose state and beat him within an inch of his life. And this white man started to read scriptures over him and pray for him and talk to him and love him. And in that moment, John Perkins was able to find the love of Jesus Christ. And as he went his days forward, he decided to change his job and made it his mission that he would continue to preach a gospel that would be able to change the lives of the very men who put him to within an inch of his life. When he was interviewed, coming post that time, there were 2 pastors in the U.S. that had come across his story. And they had heard that at the trial of those policemen, as they stood under sentencing for what they had done to this man, they offered John Perkins the opportunity to stand up and say anything, to say any last words. And he stood up and he says, "Judge, I have forgiven these men, and I would ask for you to do the same and allow them to walk free." When he was interviewed by these 2 pastors several years later, and they said, "How could you stand up in that courtroom and say what you said?" He recounted that moment, and as deep furrows on his brow, and he got into the pain of the moment, and he said, "There was a moment when I was between consciousness and unconsciousness and waking up and falling back to sleep again as they were beating me, that I looked upon their faces and I saw the distorted, twisted work of hatred of the evil one. And I realized in that moment that they could do no other thing. That even as I was being abused and suffering at their hands, so they had been abused by our greatest enemy, the devil. And in that moment, my anger turned to deep compassion while they were beating me. And I longed for a day where I would be able to stand in front of them and say, "I forgive you." John Perkins' life stands as a confrontation to us as we sit here in Durban, as we sit in society today, and 2 people are presented, the ones that have allowed hatred to so grip themselves that determines their every action towards other human beings, or the one who forgives and is filled with compassion because he understands that all of humanity has been gripped and twisted and distorted by the work of sin. Today, what we do is we carry on in our series, and so for those that are maybe new here, we're into the 5th part of a series called Waymaker, where we're looking at the humanity of Jesus. And we're seeing something of his life, and we're understanding how does his life invite us into a greater way of living in our human capacity. And so this morning, what I want to do is I've entitled the message just Overcoming Prejudice. And I had considered calling it Overcoming Hate. But then I realized that for many of us in today's culture, if I were to say, "Do you hate people?" Probably none of us would put up our hands. Whereas prejudice seems a little softer and a little broader. Like if I were to say, are there prejudices that we hold against people? We might be honest enough to go, yes. When I have people in my home for dinner and they don't eat the same way that I eat, or they leave my house a little bit more untidy than when they came, or people that just do things a bit differently, or they think a little bit differently. If I'm really honest with myself, sometimes there's a prejudice that's deep down. And Jesus invites us into a story that allows us to deal with our prejudices. Even as we've looked over the last weeks of Jesus overcoming temptation and therefore inviting us into a story of being able to overcome temptation, how Jesus was able to overcome his own self and his own flesh in the garden, how he was able to overcome sin and how he was able to overcome death. And now we stand this first Sunday after Easter, after this high moment in the Christian calendar, where we have been speaking about his resurrection and how that changes everything for us. And so this morning, as we look at overcoming prejudice, I want to say with really compassion and love in my heart that the point of today is not to point fingers. The point today is to invite us into a way of life that Jesus even said. He came in John chapter 10, verse 10. He says, I've come that you may have life and have it to the full. And so today is about freedom. Today is about being able to expose some of those areas of our life where maybe prejudice hides and exists. It's about putting a spotlight on some of those dark recesses of our hearts. It's going to be a little uncomfortable, but my point is not, again, to come with a stick or to point fingers. As Paul would write in the scriptures, I, the chief of sinners, need Jesus' forgiveness and salvation. And so today I come inviting us in with great compassion that we can be free from living in the pain and the distortion and the twistedness of what the enemy has done within our broken humanity. And so this message is a little bit confrontational just in terms of the content. But I really do trust that you would hear it from me. I am not being confrontational. Certainly my desire is not to be confrontational, even if the scriptures do that to us. I'm also going to be sharing one or two stories that I've never shared from the pulpit, just about me, and some things that I went through last year. And again, I trust that you would hear it just from a pastor's heart to say, my story is I know so many of your stories. And hopefully in something of the journey that I've gone through, it can help you in your journey as you go through. And so that's where we're going to go today. We live in a world where the world is shouting pretty loudly. Today, tolerance, or as much as tolerance is preached, it's not something that the world knows. Everybody wants to shout louder and louder, and what people are shouting is around division and around distortedness and around anger and is around hatred. And the only way we seem to get our point across is to shout louder. But Jesus came and he used his voice, but he didn't shout. His voice was to offer a different way. And so in the keeping into the context of our series of Waymaker, Jesus, this human, yes, fully God, and we looked at his divinity in the I Am series earlier this year, but now as we're looking in his humanity and how he made a way for us to be able to follow in his footsteps so that what he was able to do is not unattainable for us ourselves. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. And we start in Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 48. And it's a series of teaching that Jesus is doing. He's on a mountain. There's a whole bunch of people. They say thousands of people are listening to him. And Jesus is just kind of telling us how we could live a better life, how we could live more freely. But he says some things here that I don't know that I really like. And so we're going to look at it. And we're going to start by just opening up our hearts a little. You have heard that it was said, Jesus says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I really don't like that Jesus said that, if I'm honest. There are some people that I believe don't deserve my love or forgiveness because of the way they treat me or other people. But that's not what Jesus says. That you may be children of our Father in heaven. Hold on, Jesus, are you putting conditions upon how we become children of our Father in heaven? We know that we're saved by the grace of God. We're not saved because of our works. And yet there is something of the salvation of Jesus that starts to work out in us. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Well, not even the tax collectors doing that. Tax collectors in that day, we're going to get to a story about tax collectors a little bit later, but they were like the real low of the low. If you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans or those that don't believe in Jesus do that. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So Jesus says some really challenging things here about loving our enemies and being able to greet those and live with those that are not like us, that we do not necessarily like. And so this confrontation starts to happen with Jesus as he starts to live in a way that was not the way of humanity in our twisted and distorted shape. And so there are a couple of things that we're going to take out of Jesus' life. How did Jesus set the way, and what can we learn in order to follow that way and become a little bit more human, a little bit more in the way that he created us and intended us to be? And so we start with this first principle. Jesus confronted prejudice. He confronted prejudice. There's a story in John chapter 4, and I'm not going to read the whole text, but there's a story where he says to his disciples, listen, we're going to go. They were in an area called Judea. I don't expect you to know ancient Israel territories, but Judea was at the bottom, Samaria was in the middle, and Galilee was at the top. And he needed to go from Judea to Galilee, but Samaritans and Jews hated each other. Samaritans were regarded as half-breeds. They were Jews that had been cut off from the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of God, and they had kind of intermarried with Gentiles, and so they had not remained pure Israelites. And so there was this real battle, this national purity battle that took place between the Jews and Samaritans. And so what would happen is whenever a Jew needed to get to Galilee, they would bypass Samaria. They wouldn't go through Samaria. Practically what that meant is this. I'm just giving you a little history lesson to understand the level of hatred here. It would add a marathon distance, 42 kilometers, they say. But remember, we're not talking about just putting on your running shoes and running. We're relocating families. We're talking, it's animals, it's foods, it's homes, it's whatever. And so that trip could take several days. That meant holding a prejudice cost them time and cost them money, because they would have to organize accommodation for an extra few days to go around. So that's just something of the context. But this is what Jesus does. He tells the disciples, the scriptures just say, Jesus had to go through Samaria. No, he didn't. Jesus was living a way that was confronting prejudice. The disciples that were with him, the people that had gathered around him, had for years, for generations, walked around Samaria. Jesus says, I know that this is your way. I'm going to directly confront it. We're going straight up. We're going to go through the towns and the villages of Samaria. And then there comes this encounter where he sends his disciples away to go and get him some food, and he's at a well, and a woman comes out. Now again, understand the context. Jews didn't relate to Samaritans, and men didn't relate to women. And then we read in the scriptures, this particular woman, by Jewish standards, was regarded as an adulteress because she had had 5 husbands and was presently living with a man that wasn't her husband. And so in Jewish custom, Jewish law, the right thing to do was to pick up a stone and kill her. Jesus has this moment where he doesn't only not pick up a stone and kill her, he speaks with her, loves her, introduces himself to her, and saves her. And so this is the story that we read. I'm going to pick out this is John chapter 4, but just 1 or 2 little verses. When the Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? And the Samaritan woman said to her, you're a Jew. I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you speak to me? How can you ask me for a drink? So immediately, her prejudice has been confronted by Jesus. Goes on a little bit, and the story goes on. And then she says to Jesus, I can see you're a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say it has to worship there. Again, there's confrontation here. There's prejudice here. You think you're right, I think I'm right. And Jesus just gently introduces himself to her. She gets saved. She runs to her town, and the scriptures say the whole town got saved. And so here's something of the uniqueness of this story. Oh, in the middle of this, I forget, the disciples arrive back. So can you imagine these disciples, this group of men, they first of all have gone through Samaria. They're in Samaria. It's like, hey, Jesus, my parents taught me that we could never go this road. So they've been confronted on that prejudice. Now they arrive back, and the guy they're following them is talking to a woman, which shouldn't be happening. And not only talking to a woman, but talking to an adulteress. It's like, Jesus, are you going to pick up a stone? And so Jesus on 3 fronts confronts their own prejudice. And these disciples are left now following Jesus to say, what is our way? And then they see what happens, and this whole town come to salvation, the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And suddenly the disciples' minds must start thinking, whoa, what we would have normally done, we would never have seen salvation of a town. But because Jesus has confronted his prejudice, confronted a prejudice, a whole town gets saved. And so what Jesus invites us into as the Waymaker, as we look at overcoming prejudice, is we have to ask ourselves the question, how many people in this city of Durban are not meeting Jesus because we're not confronting our prejudices? How many roads are we not taking? How many people are we not talking to because they're different or other than? Or seemingly on the other side of the tracks to us, whichever side of the tracks you were born. In whichever way your culture has brought you up. How many of us, at great cost and time and energy and effort, are holding on to our prejudices? And Jesus makes a way by confronting the prejudice. By keep going there. A little story. Some of you may have been here a year ago, and we had a French pastor couple come out here, Matthew and Stephanie. And in that moment, it was just after the floods last year. And they asked if I could take them out to drive through a community called Amaoti, which many of you, or some of you are here this morning, sitting in this room from, that we love and have worked into for nearly 20 years as a community. And as I drove them through, the car was very quiet. Many of us won't know that what had taken place over those floods is Amaoti got absolutely decimated. Roads got taken out and infrastructure. And as I was driving him through, Stephanie, who was a social worker, so her heart naturally is inclined towards the pain of people and wanting to help that. She just had tears running down her face. And I turned, I had Matthew next to me in the car and Stephanie behind me. And I turned and I said, Stephanie, I can understand the tears, but what in particular is catching your attention right now? And she said, Richard, for the last 3 days, I've heard you and Jax complain about load shedding and 2 hours a day, not electricity, or 2 times 2 hours a day, not electricity. And then we drive into a community like this, and they have very little. They have no electricity. Things have been wiped out, but you're complaining about your 2 hours a day. Imagine a group of you in your church could take your collective frustration about your 2 hours a day, and you could harness that and gather that together and come and change a community in Amaoti. Needless to say, the car from then on was a very quiet place as I felt the Spirit of God start to shine a light in something of the deep recesses of my heart. And she only had that not because of us as a community, but because Jax and I had been hosting her. And I got before God and I was like, God, has too much of Durban North got into me? And that's not to criticize, I live here. That's not to criticize those of us that live here by any stretch of the imagination, but it's to allow the prejudices that are possibly a little deeper than our surface orientation. We like to live today on a very surface, shallow level, but it takes time and space and confrontation to be able to get to something of the deeper, darker recesses of our heart. And when God just shines a light on it, sometimes it's a little bit painful. But Jesus showed us a way. He invites us into a greater way of life. He allows us to see a different way. That if we would confront the prejudices, maybe a whole town will get saved. Could Durban be saved if we would confront our prejudices and have conversations across the aisle? Just a question that I think we need to answer for ourselves. The second thing we see Jesus does is he forgives prejudice. He forgives prejudice. The best place we go to this is when Jesus is being executed unjustly. He's got Roman soldiers that are busy bargaining and playing or gambling for his clothes. And he's got Pharisees that are mocking him. And he's got a crowd that are jeering him. And we've got people that have beat him. And we've got people that are spitting on him. And in the midst of all of that, Jesus is able, and he's got two criminals that are deserving of their execution on either side of him. And they're busy mocking him and jeering him, we read in Matthew. And then Jesus says, Lord, forgive them. Father, forgive them. Because they don't know what they're doing. If I can just extrapolate that a little bit around what we're saying, what Jesus was doing here was actually there's prejudice in the human heart. There's a distortion. There's a twistedness to this humanity here. And actually they don't know what they're doing. There is no other way for them to behave because culture has directed them in such a way that their hearts have become so filled with hate towards others that they can only behave like that. Father, forgive them. And then we see that even in Jesus' words of forgiving prejudice, we see these two beautiful moments. The Roman centurion, who was probably spitting on him and jeering him at the time of his crucifixion. We see that when Jesus died and the heavens split and it was dark overhead, and we hear all that went on around that time. The Roman centurion suddenly has this moment and he says, surely this was the Son of God. And then we have one of the criminals on the cross turn from jeering him and saying, whoa, okay. Jesus, would you remember me when you get to paradise? And he tells the other guy, he says, hey, listen, we're dying justly. Stop mocking this man. And so what started out as a mocking on the cross suddenly becomes a salvation moment because Jesus forgives prejudice. And Jesus invites us to open up and forgive those that are prejudiced against us, to forgive those that have hated us, to forgive those that have done ghastly things to us. And in that act of forgiveness, so we may have a Roman centurion being saved, so we may have a criminal on a cross being saved, so we may have our neighbor being saved, so we may have our friend being saved, so we may have somebody not like us being saved. And as they run back to their communities, a community, a town, a village, a city meets Jesus. The power of confronting and forgiving prejudice. I'm going to tell a story that I've never shared publicly, but I feel like I can share it without any pain or hook in my heart, well, without a hook in my heart. Last year, I've had the privilege of being 20 years doing what I'm doing. And last year was undoubtedly the hardest year that I have ever faced in ministry. And there was a moment, some of you will know that we used to run a ministry called the Domino Foundation, and beautiful work, beautiful work. And on the board, we started to have some trouble a year ago, or just over a year ago, and some hatred started to get into some of the board members. And there was a particular meeting where hatred so overcame the twisted, distorted work of the enemy had become so visible and evident in a person, and it all blew up. And that was a very painful moment for me, and I didn't handle it the best. And then I had the privilege of going on a sabbatical, and in the sabbatical I was asking God, would you heal me? And I was reading a book which I highly recommend all of you read, The Way of the Dragon or The Way of the Lamb. And in this story, it's where I came across the story of John Perkins, this black man who was beaten to within an inch of his life. And it was that moment where he just said, actually, I saw the pain and the hatred on these men's faces as they beat me, and I couldn't have hate back for them as they hated me. I could only have compassion. And I was just like, God, that's my desire. And I feel like the Spirit of God was able to work in me, and I was able to walk in the way of Jesus, which I'm very grateful for. This is not a pat me on the back story. It's just that Jesus can do this in the midst of great pain. And I said, God, I'm unable to teleport myself back into that board meeting, but I would love to. But the best I can do is go and redeem that in my head. And I put myself back into that meeting, and as I looked at a particular board member who was so twisted and distorted with anger and hatred towards me, which started something of the breakaway of Domino and Anthem, a greatly pained story. I was able to replay that and go, God, I forgive them. I forgive them. Because I, like them, have been twisted and distorted by the work of the evil one. My humanity has been broken, and we all stand needing the mercy and the grace of Jesus Christ. And so I've been able to redeem that moment, at least for me, so I live free of the anger of that moment, and it's now a compassionate moment for me as I remember it. But I'm so grateful for God for what He's done in me, and the invitation of Jesus is that can be all of our stories. For those that have lived under hatred, for those that have lived under abuse, for those that have lived under a broken humanity and the effects of it, Jesus' desire for us is that we wouldn't act like the 12 highway policemen and want to beat the other person, whether we physically do it or we do it in our own minds. We all know that story, right? Whether we do it in our own minds to those people, beat them within an inch of their life, or we like the person that comes to read the scriptures and stands up and can stand up in the court case and appeal to the judge for forgiveness and leniency and mercy. Jesus invites us into this story. And He says it can be ours. We can live free. Christ, the scriptures teaches us, came. It's for freedom that I have come to set you free. That you may live free from the grip of sin. You may live free from the anger of repeating hate, of having hate in your own heart and prejudice in your own heart towards those that have prejudiced you. We can be free from that in Christ Jesus. And so the second thing we see is Jesus forgives prejudice. The third thing we see is that Jesus worked against prejudice. This gets a little bit lighthearted here. I know it's been a bit heavy, but this gets a little lighthearted, and I really do enjoy this story. And so Jesus is just starting out on His ministry, and he calls a couple of guys to Him. One of them is a guy called Peter, who's a burly fisherman and quite a strong character, and kind of speaks before he thinks, like many of us, I think. And he's just that guy. And as he's going about his daily walk, Jesus would, there were these tax collectors. And so tax collectors were guys that were, Israel under those days had been overtaken by the Romans. And what the Romans would do is they would find Jewish men who would take money off of the Jews and then give it to the Romans for some money. And so the Jews that had sold themselves out pretty much to Roman rule, that's who the tax collectors were. The Israelites hated them. And when I say hate, I mean hate. Like the tax collectors were the worst of the worst. Adultery, murder, all of that kind of stuff was was less than tax collectors. Just to understand something of the context of here, to be a traitor was the highest degree of twisted and distorted life. And so Jesus would have walked past who we know to be Matthew, his tax collecting booth, multiple times. And Peter, no doubt, would have been behind him, a fisherman who was just trying to make a hard day's work and wage and trying to just live off what he was selling, what he was catching and then selling. But the tax man was taking all of his money. Yeah, we know the story. We can identify with this. It hasn't much changed over 2,000 years. And I can picture Jesus with Peter talking, because Peter, I guess, wouldn't just say it directly to Jesus, but I think he would say it to his brother who was walking behind Jesus, loud enough so that Jesus could hear as they were walking past the tax collector's booth. Like, jeez, I hate that guy. That guy should die. I wish God would just wipe him out. He just takes all of our money. He's sold out to the Romans. He doesn't deserve to live. My guess is that was something of the conversation, which was just loud enough for Jesus to hear. And then in Mark's account, it says there was a moment where actually there was a crowd behind Jesus when he walked past the tax collector's booth. And so I think what was happening now is Peter has now got some mates behind him. And I think the noise as they walked past Matthew's tax collecting booth was getting a little bit louder. And I can picture Matthew putting his head down every time these guys walked past, because there was this confrontation of prejudice and hate. And this every time, I wouldn't even be surprised if some of the crowd that were walking behind Jesus as they walked past Matthew's booth weren't spitting at him, or just, this guy's a scum and lowlife. And I can picture the scene one day. Jesus turns around, sees, The crowd's big enough now. The noise is big enough. The prejudice is loud enough. Hey, Matthew, why don't you come join us? Come join us. And I can imagine what the disciples were doing in that moment in time. Like, Jesus, are you out of your mind? But they should have learned by then that he was going to confront prejudice. They didn't yet know that he was going to forgive prejudice because he hadn't yet gone to the cross. But this was all part of the lesson. And I bet Jesus called Matthew for two reasons. One, he wanted to see Matthew set free, but I reckon he also called Matthew just to see what Peter was going to do. How are you going back there, Peter? Muttering under his breath as he had to walk along with his own prejudices, confronted with them within his own heart. Who is this man that I've now decided to follow? I reckon Jesus was like, are you going to still stay with me? Because I've offered Matthew the same life that I've offered you? Are you going to hold it against him that I've offered him life? That I've forgiven him? That my mercy extends to him? And so this story works itself out. And I just love the fact that Jesus could do that. And it kind of makes us wonder that even as Matthew, I'm sure Jesus would have called him, but Matthew's head would have been down. And he was like, did that guy just call my name? My head's down because there's a crowd and they're all spitting at me and cursing me while they're walking past. And Jesus says, yeah, you, Matthew. And I reckon Matthew in that moment would have been surprised by Jesus' call to come and follow him. He knew he had sold himself out. I wonder how many of us were surprised when Jesus called us, or how many of us are still going to be surprised when Jesus calls us. But even more than that, I wonder if we were able to work actively against our own prejudices, who we could surprise by our love for them, as opposed to our anger or hatred for them. I wonder what surprising things might come of it, like a Samaritan woman at the well, an adulteress, who goes back and an entire town gets saved as they meet Jesus. As we read the scriptures, we see that Jesus confronted prejudice and worked against prejudice so often. The majority of the time that we read in the scriptures was around a dining room table as he had meals with people. And so I love the story continues with Matthew. And so I can imagine there's Peter, who is very vocal about this tax collector that he doesn't like. There's this crowd that are rising in their vocality around that. And Jesus says, hey, Matthew, come. We good? Okay? Even if there was a bit of rumbling. And then Jesus takes it one step further and he says, Matthew, hey, tonight, all of us, we're coming to your house for dinner. I can imagine some of the disciples, some of these guys walking behind Jesus, the crowd, would have lost the plot right then and probably left him. As prejudice got exposed in their hearts and they realized they couldn't follow Jesus. They weren't prepared to deal with it and have their prejudice dealt with and a light shone upon it. And so then they go for the dinner, and then all the Pharisees, all the religious people start saying, Jesus, you're having dinner with sinners and tax collectors. And so there's this whole confrontation and outworking. And Jesus is quite all right to just have meal after meal after meal with people that are not like him as he invites them into a greater story, as he invites them into another way of life, as he invites them to say, hey, we can live free of anger and hatred. We can live free of all of that, and the invitation is yours, one meal at a time as we get to know people. The name of Jesus has been used to harm and to divide, which is so crazy when we look at Jesus' life, because he was the antithesis of exclusivity. He was the most inclusive person. He was happy to sit down and talk and invite anybody into a way of life that was better for them, more along the lines of the humanity that God designed for us to have. Today, as a pastor, I observe people, and our homes have been closed for the most part. And so I want to land this message with a series of questions, 3 questions, but they all link together. When was the last time you opened your home to somebody? And just in case that happened to be last night, when was the last time you had dinner with somebody? And just in case that also happened to be last night, when was the last time you had dinner with someone that's not like you? And just in case that was also last night, when was the last time you had someone for the first time in your home for dinner? So the way of Jesus, friends, is a way of communion and relationship and conversation. It's not a way of social media where we throw stones behind faceless opinions. It's about having people of different backgrounds and cultures and upbringings and inviting them into the same story of mercy and grace that many of us in this room have received. It's about confronting prejudice. It's about forgiving prejudice. And it's about actively working against prejudice. It's the story of Jesus. And as the Waymaker, he lived that out in his humanity. And he says, will you follow me? And so I tied back to John Perkins' story. In that moment of between consciousness and unconsciousness, he looks at the faces, the distorted, hate-filled faces, and he says, God, I am compassionate for them. Forgive them, because they've not come yet to understand the humanity that is offered to us in Jesus Christ. They can do no other. Those were an echo of the words of Jesus on the cross. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And they're the words that are extended to us today. To say, would our hearts be filled with compassion for a humanity that has been overcome by sin and evil? But there is a solution. His name is Jesus. His name is Jesus. Can we stand together?